It was the 1960s and the height of the Cold War. The United States of America had experienced a number of successes in both world wars, as well as the Korean War. Around the world, European powers were struggling to hold on to their colonies, with many fighting for independence from countries such as England and the Netherlands, Belgium and France. Despite the long history of European superpowers in Southeast Asia, going as far back as Marco Polo in the 13th century, their presence as overlords in the region was going to be challenged. The chaotic outcome of their departure would lay the foundations of one of the most controversial wars of the 20th century, the Vietnam War. Complicated by Cold War tensions, this war would influence how the new superpower that is the United States of America would throw its weight around the global stage. In exploring the history of Vietnam, we will begin by outlining the sequence of events that led to the French colonization of the nation. In the 1780s, an internal rebellion known as the Tay Son Rebellion took place in the southern region of modern-day Vietnam. A group of reformers rebelled against the king, led by three brothers from the village of Tay Son. The rebellion had the slogan of "Seize the property of the rich and redistribute to the poor." Revolting against the elite, the Tay Son abolished taxes, freed prisoners and distributed food to the hungry. As their movements gained momentum, the Tay Son took control of Quy Nhon, making it the Tay Son capital. By 1778, they had control of the southern part of the country. The royal family was executed, leaving the 16-year-old nephew of the last lord who ruled over southern Vietnam, Nguyen Anh. He would seek help from a French bishop by the name Pignon de Behaim, and in exchange for military assistance, he offered a large territory of Vietnam. The French would provide ships, cannons and support that would help him lead a series of assaults against the divided Tay Son rulership. In 1802, Anh captured Hanoi, ending the Tay Son dynasty and beginning the Nguyen dynasty. Anh, now emperor of the unified Nam Viet, as he called it, the Catholic faith was tolerated and French missionaries were permitted to preach Christianity. His successors, starting with Minh Mang, who came to power in 1820, would however take a more adversarial stance against Christianity. Missionaries and Vietnamese Christians were persecuted and a number of them executed. The persecution of missionaries would be used as a pretext by the French to invade Vietnam in 1857 under Napoleon III. In the subsequent decades, Vietnam would sign a number of treaties ceding territories to France. France would expand its control over additional territories, and by 1885, Vietnam was no longer independent. By the end of the 19th century, the French had successfully created the Indo-Chinese Union, consisting of Cochin, China, in the south of Vietnam, Annam in the center of Vietnam, Tonkin in the north, Cambodia and Laos. Very much like other European colonies around the world, Vietnam would be exploited for its resources under French colonial rule, with administrators holding a majority of the political power. Railroads, bridges and other infrastructure were built to facilitate the export of natural resources such as rice, coal, tin and rubber. This essentially created a peasantry that was worse off than the wealthy elite, who owned the land either as French administrators or landlords who often had collaboration with the French. This class of people, for the most part, owned no land and little political power. In the following decades, you would see France maintain a strong hold on Vietnam despite the rise of nationalist sentiments in the country. In the First World War, France was able to get about 70,000 troops from Vietnam to come to its aid. Attempts to institute reforms were suppressed by the French. For example, in February 1930, when the Vietnamese Nationalist Party attempted a failed military uprising, killing French soldiers. The result, the soldiers involved were executed. The same year, 1930, a new figure by the name Ho Chi Minh burst into the scene. As a young man living in France in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, Ho Chi Minh was an outspoken critic of French colonialism and an advocate for independence. Inspired by Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution, Ho Chi Minh would go to Moscow in 1923, where he learned Marxist doctrine and joined the French Communist Party in 1930. He would often visit China, establishing relations with members of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In 1941, Ho Chi Minh would form the League for the Independence of Vietnam, Viet Minh for short, as part of his quest to gain independence from French rule and Japanese military occupation. By the start of the Second World War, In June 1940, France had given Japan permission to occupy parts of Vietnam. At the same time, Ho Chi Minh was building a force of guerrilla fighters, and by the end of the Second World War, after Japanese withdrawal from Vietnam, his troops launched an insurrection, seizing Hanoi in the north of Vietnam, from where, in September 1945, he and his league declared the Democratic State of Vietnam. Despite an attempt at a truce with the French, by the summer of 1946, a war lasting 8 years would begin. The war ended with peace talks at Geneva, with the French, who were receiving financial help from the United States, and Ho Chi Minh settling for a compromise. Two results came out of the peace talks. Firstly, Vietnam would be divided into a communist north, led by Ho Chi Minh, and a non-communist south, led by Bao Dai. Secondly, neither the north nor the south would ally themselves with outside parties. However, Ho Chi Minh was determined to reunite the country under communism. Laos and Cambodia had also become independent during the war. At first, the United States had decided it would not intervene despite not wanting Vietnam to fall into communist hands. You see, at the time, there was the domino theory, named after a 1954 speech by Eisenhower. As the name suggests, the fear was that if one country, in this case Vietnam, fell to communism, similar countries in surrounding areas would also fall to communism. Of course, it didn't help that Vietnam was close to both Communist China and the Soviet Union, and this was the height of the Cold War after all. But as the French left South Vietnam, the United States would establish its own government in the South, with Diem at its head. By the late 50s, violence had broken out, and the Communist Viet Cong, aided by North Vietnam and its leader Ho Chi Minh, launched a series of attacks in South Vietnam. By 1962, John F. Kennedy began ramping up military presence in South Vietnam, and after a coup that resulted in the death of Diem, South Vietnam was asking the US for further assistance. On the 2nd of August 1964, a torpedo attack on an American destroyer led to the passage of the Tonkin Resolution at the request of Lyndon B. Johnson. The Senate would pass the resolution with only 2 opposing votes. The House of Representatives passed it unanimously. The attack provided justification for further involvement by the United States in the conflict, a justification that would evolve as the conflict developed. On the 2nd of March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder was launched. Authorized by Johnson, this intense bombing campaign of North Vietnam would last 3 years. Its chief aim was that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong would be weakened and bring Ho Chi Minh to the negotiating table. A few days later, ground troops began to arrive in the south. With the use of guerrilla warfare and air defense equipment provided by other communist states, North Vietnam was able to protect itself. Tunnels and damaged infrastructure were rebuilt. Operation Rolling Thunder would be hampered by its intermittent nature. Sometimes, weeks would go by before bombings were restarted. Bombs were also dropped on neighboring Laos and Cambodia in a bid to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail, a network of supplies for the communist troops. With over 100,000 casualties, chaos ensued. Mistrust had risen amongst US soldiers who questioned the rationale for the war, often leading to mutinies and the fragging of officers by their juniors. Many men would desert, and many more would dodge the draft in the United States. Back home, horrified by pictures and videos coming out of Vietnam, an anti-war movement was forming, with demonstrations across the United States. After all, this was the first time in history that a war on this scale would be televised. Celebrities ranging from Muhammad Ali, Martin Luther King Jr., Jimi Hendrix, and Bob Dylan protested America's involvement in the Vietnam War. Despite these protests, the United States, worried about being seen as soft on communism, would continue its involvement in Vietnam. The Tet Offensive in 1968 saw a series of attacks on more than 100 territories in the south of Vietnam. Demonstrations back in the US would influence Lyndon B. Johnson to stop the bombings, and the election of Nixon that very same year meant that bombings were resumed, as was the withdrawal of American troops. Nixon would also continue peace talks with the aid of his Secretary of State, a man by the name Henry Kissinger. Peace talks would however be unproductive. Leaked classified documents showing that the governments knew the war was unwinnable would spur protests. Anti-war demonstrations would gain further momentum after learning about the Lai massacre, in which hundreds of Vietnamese civilians were killed by US troops. By June 1972, with thousands of lives lost and billions of dollars worth of infrastructure damaged. Both sides attempted a peace agreement which failed. The following year, following negotiations, all sides of the conflict, including the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, representing the North, the Republic of Vietnam, representing the South, the Provisional Revolutionary Government of the Republic of South Vietnam, representing the Communists in the South, and, finally, the United States would sign a peace agreement in the Paris Peace Accords, officially called Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam. The agreements would effectively end America's involvement in the conflict, and for their role in securing the peace deal, Henry Kissinger and Lee Duc-Tho, who negotiated on behalf of the North Vietnamese, would win a Nobel Peace Prize. Tho would, however, reject the prize. Despite the agreement, fighting would pretty much resume immediately after, and continue for another 2 years, with both sides violating the terms of the deal. Hanoi, capital of the North, would remain committed to reunifying Vietnam under its control. Although Nixon had promised to continue providing military assistance, by 1974 he had resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal, and the war-weary United States would renege on this promise. The North would leverage this opportunity and continue attacks until April 30th, 1975, with the fall of Saigon. Amidst the chaos that would ensue, American helicopters would try to evacuate its Vietnamese allies as well as its troops and nationals on the ground. The South would surrender the same day. In the immediate aftermath, Vietnam would be reunified as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, a name it holds still today. The Vietnam War is one of the most controversial wars that the United States has ever taken part in, with an estimated 50,000 Americans dead and many more disabled, at a cost of $176 billion, nearly $1 trillion in today's money. The greatest loss, however, was borne by the Vietnamese people, with an estimate of between 1 to 3 million killed. Many were civilian. Millions were also displaced and much of the environments were destroyed. In the US, changes would have to be made. The Vietnam War would be the last time the draft was used to recruit troops. Estimates vary, but with an average age of 22, many of the soldiers drafted were not even eligible to vote. In 1971, Congress would pass the 26th Amendment, extending the right to vote to those aged 18 and over. This was done in record time. Congress would also pass the War Powers Resolution, limiting the president's ability to declare war overseas. To do so, Congress would have to be consulted before engaging US troops in foreign combat for more than 90 days. This was done to prevent a repeat of the bombings that took place in Vietnam and Cambodia at the behest of Nixon. America's failure in the war would also serve as a reality check for the nation, which was now proven to be fallible. Trust of politicians amongst its citizens was now at an all-time low. Some key US officials involved in the war would later express regrets over the tragedy. For example, Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense under Kennedy and Johnson, said in a 1995 book, "We of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations who participated in the decisions on Vietnam acted according to what we thought were the principles and traditions of this nation. We made our decisions in light of those values. Yet we were wrong. Terribly wrong." In the 2003 documentary, Fog of War, he was also quoted saying, "We do not have the God-given right to shape every nation in our image or as we choose." He would take his lesson from the Vietnam experience and oppose the 2003 US invasion of Iraq, saying, "If we can't persuade our allies and other comparable nations, we had better examine our reasoning." His warnings would fall on deaf ears. Considering the Vietnamese people bear the brunt of the war's losses, it's important to know how the Vietnamese people saw the events that took shape. In the West, the conflict is mostly seen as a civil war that took place between the communist North and an anti-communist South, one that was exacerbated by foreign powers such as the US and China and Soviets. For many Vietnamese, the war was seen as an anti-colonial struggle, first from a European power in France and then the United States. This was not too dissimilar from other anti-colonial struggles in the mid-20th century. Many didn't understand the American view that saw communism as a threat. For them, the Americans were just another invading power in the long history of struggle for independence, going as far back as 100 BC with Chinese occupation. A difference in perspectives is best evidenced in the fact that, in Vietnam, the war is actually referred to as the American War. The truth is, of course, a messy combination of these perspectives. The US in particular viewed things through an anti-communist lens. What they didn't recognize is that what many nationalist North Vietnamese leaders wanted was a unified Vietnam, and communism was their chosen path to independence. Decades later, the legacy of the Vietnam War lives on, and in the context of Western foreign policy, the debate about the Western role in international crisis continues. Critics of intervention mention Vietnam, and more recently, Iraq and Afghanistan, as notable examples of its failures when meddling. Proponents of intervention point to America's success in both World Wars and Korea, and also its failure to intervene in the Rwandan as reasons why intervention can be necessary. But what side of the debate do you sit on? Do you favor a more interventionist approach, or would you rather countries spent less time meddling in foreign crises? Or perhaps, the more cynical amongst you would remember Eisenhower's warnings about the military-industrial complex. You might say that the war was continued for the benefit of the few who would profit from its prolongation.